Our third presenter is Clare Crowston, Professor of History and now Chair of the Department of History at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Clare received her PhD from Cornell in 1996. She published her prize-winning first monograph, Fabricating Women, the Seamstresses of Old Regime France, 1675 to 1791, with Duke in 2001, and it had a profound impact on French women's history. It also won the Hagley Prize for Best Book in Business History and the Berkshire Prize for Best First Book in History written by a woman in North America. Her second monograph, The Methodologically Innovative Credit, Fashion, and Sex, Economics of Regard in Old Regime France, came out with Duke in 2013, and as you all know, was the subject of a very interesting H France forum. Apparently, a prerequisite for participating on this panel is having written or co-written a textbook on European history. Clare is co-author of History of Western Society and Understanding Western Society, and the fact that all three of them have textbooks that are out and being used, I think, is also evidence of something. So, Clare?
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Wow, it gets a little harder to dance after a wonderful performance by my predecessors. I have to dance faster, and I have to learn a lot of new stuff all of a sudden. We discussed amongst ourselves a little bit by email in advance, and so looking out at all of you, it's a huge honor to be speaking in front of you, but I think any one of you could be sitting up here contributing to the discussion, and I think if you want to move fairly soon to opening the floor and letting you talk. So all this to say that I'll be fairly brief. So there are three potential issues, I think, I'd state that are interrelated but worth analytically separating, and all three of them have been discussed. Well, at least the first two have been discussed in some detail already. The first is the undergraduate enrollment crisis in the humanities, which is a national crisis occurring across the humanities. There may be dimensions of it that are particular to French studies, that is French language and literature, as well as history. But this is a shared crisis, and I think it needs a collaborative and collective effort across the humanities. So we don't need to say French history at the expense of destroying some other brand of humanities teaching and research. The second issue is that of graduate training and the job market, and I'm very conscious of what I'm saying because I'm delighted to have 6 University of Illinois PhD students in French history and in the history of French Illinois, so welcome Illinois graduate students. And you can see from their presence and also from this wonderful program that there is in fact tremendous vitality, not just in people who have been around here for a while, but in the emerging scholars who are still in grad school or recently emerged from their PhDs. But it is a big question. Do universities and colleges still see French history as an important investment for future hiring and program building? As people like us begin to retire, will we be replaced with French historians? What are the prospects for accepting new graduate students? And again, this is a shared issue across history and the humanities, and I think, again, here, our thoughts about how to address it need to be collective and shared. And the third issue, which maybe we haven't talked about too much so far, is more of an intellectual issue about French history itself. Is this still a field that occupies a cutting-edge place in our discipline the way it once did? So this final question, I think, is a more difficult question, perhaps harder to talk about, but I think it also calls for attention. These three things intersect in really important ways. You can't understand or address one without the other, but in about 10 minutes I can't take them all, and in fact we've already heard a lot about them. So I'm going to say just very quickly from the perspective of my public university, which you may have read about the state of Illinois, very briefly about enrollment, but then talk more about this third issue of specific to the writing of French history. So our majors are down currently from a peak of 600 to around 262. Math now has about 1,800 majors. They have tripled in size. Well, we have lost almost, well, it had been, we went down and we're up a little bit now. Our enrollments have fallen by 50%. And there are a series of reasons that you're all familiar with for why this would take place. It has For those of you teaching in public institutions, the increasing withdrawal of the state from funding for public higher education means that our provosts and our chancellors are more reliant on tuition dollars and ever more needing to be accountable to the public. Ironically, as the public comprises a smaller and smaller chunk of our budget, it's now about 12% in Illinois when there is a budget, which we have not had for about a year and a half. This has led to budget cuts in my department, informal freeze. I've been told that we are not a priority for hiring. But the good news, and there is good news, I think, is that from our perspective, we see the pendulum beginning to swing a little bit back, actually away from the STEM focus. I don't know if any of you have seen this, but I think the public discourse is actually beginning to change, and there have been enough pleas for the humanities that felt like pleading to deaf ears, but that actually, I think that they have been heard to a certain extent. Our students are eager to study French history or to study history. They suffer more from their peers making fun of them, actually, than from the resistance of their parents. But we have implemented a huge array of things that I know you all have too: better communication with undergraduate students, more close work. When I first came to Illinois 20 years ago, we were a public outstanding Research One university, and the undergrad program was not really on the agenda. We can no longer survive that way. So undergraduate education has become very important. We've updated the curriculum. We have put a huge amount of effort into career development for undergraduate students, and the result is 60 new majors joining us last year. I mean, our enrollments are starting to trend a little bit up, and so we think actually that those things can work. And I agree very much with everything that Lloyd said for undergraduate students and the program, the civic engagement and the public history element of what we do, especially at public universities, has to become ever more important, and we have to be creative, and we have to reach out to the communities in which we live much more than we have in the past. And then in terms of, and this is also true in terms of graduate education, which I won't talk about as much because Lloyd has been very inspirational about that, but very briefly, career diversity as an issue for graduate students is something perhaps belatedly, but that now is also very prominent on our agenda and something that we're thinking about a great deal. And I think obviously those things dovetail well together when we think about career opportunities and mentoring and development for our undergraduates. It's a natural step into widening and broadening what we can do with our graduate students as well. But let me just talk more specifically here about this issue of French history, which is close to my heart. So there was a time when French history was at the forefront of innovation and excitement in the discipline. And so it's not an accident that when we took historiography classes in grad school, many of them, we were proud to be in French history because the works in French history were often at the center of the curriculum. And two clusters in particular, I went and I looked at, online a bunch of graduate historiography seminars. There are still some French historians on there, but as you might anticipate, it is the Annales school, so people are still reading Marc Bloch, they're still reading Brodel, and then there's a cluster from what you might very loosely call the cultural and linguistic turn. People are still reading the Great Cat Massacre, they're still reading Joan Scott, I mean a certain section of Joan Scott, Pierre Nora on history and memory, Alain Corbin is still popular, and then there's some, Foucault, Michel de Certeau, obviously theorists. The Black Jacobins, C.L.R. James' book, seems to occupy a prominent place as well. But basically, once you move away from those canonical texts and you look for something published after 1995 or so, you really don't find much French history. And the more recent works, and this is true of my own syllabus, I teach our graduate introductory historiography class, obviously by works that focus on race and ethnicity, sexuality, nationalism, the transnational empire, global history, oral history. And so when I teach the class, I teach Natma Badi's book, Women with Mustaches, Men Without Beards, which is about 19th century Iran. I teach Louise White on South Africa. And I think this is pretty typical of the way graduate historiography or senior undergraduate historiography syllabi have changed. And so, French historians arguably have not really led in any of those areas that I just mentioned. This is a very broad brush. And I think now, as was mentioned earlier, we are playing catch-up in French history in terms of writing about France in a global or imperial or colonial context. Obviously, this is both necessary and overdue, and I think I don't have to tell you how productive and exciting the work that has been published has been. If you look at the list of Pinckney recipients from 2008 until 2014, as I just did, you'll be struck by the fact that every single one of the winners of the Pinckney Prize from 2018 to 2014 were people writing about some element of France in a global context. And so we can see how powerful and exciting this work has been, and I think we could all agree that there's much, much more to be done. We're just at the beginning of the project, not only of writing about France in the world, but also about writing about bringing, let's say, the empire back home, provincializing France, and talking about the impact in the metropole, and of rethinking things like my own field of, let's call it labor history, the history of material culture, of gender, sexuality. All those things need to be rethought through this widened lens. And so I think this is clearly a hugely important direction of the field. We can take comfort perhaps from this study that I'm sure many of you have looked at and talked about, showing that French language projected to be the top spoken language in the world by 2050, up from 6th now because of the growth of places where people speak French have the fastest growing population in the world. So French is a language. In fact, our middle school in Urbana, Illinois, has a permanent French teacher's aide available to French-speaking teacher's aide available to parents and available to families, which we never had before. This is a new thing. French is not disappearing; it's coming back into the public, and that's because we have a large community of Congolese immigrants living in Urbana-Champaign, and there's a demand for French there. But I would say, in general, and there are some other themes where perhaps French historians are leading the way. There was a fantastic workshop that I was fortunate to participate in that was led by Rafe Blafarb, who is probably here somewhere. Oh, there you are. Hi, Rafe. At FSU, the first annual Weider History Workshop on Revolutionary Economic Practices. So there's a kind of new economic history being practiced by a bunch of people emerging from grad school that I think is really great. But I think, and this is just my perspective, and I kind of hesitate to say it in front of all of you, that what we're publishing in French history is maybe no longer reaching out beyond our field of French history the way it used to. We're not really, are we writing books that everybody has to read no matter what field they're in, that become the must-reads across history or across the humanities. And I think if you think of those two things that I talked about earlier, the Annales School or that cultural linguistic turn moment when everybody was reading Lynn Hunt and everybody was reading, even before that, Natalie Davis, I would say that what those two periods have in common were that they were both periods of great interdisciplinary ambition. These were moments when history thought of itself, the Annales School, in a sort of imperial way, thought of themselves as the queen. History is the queen discipline of the social sciences. What makes history fantastic is we reach across all of these different disciplines, and I think the same was true in its own way of that moment of the cultural turn. And so it seems to me that in a way we have lost that engagement across the disciplines. We have turned inward somewhat, and I think methodologically we have given up the vast array of tools that people like Marc Bloch, Lucien Febvre were encouraging us to use. And so I guess this is sort of I'm struck when I read, when I sort of look across, there doesn't seem to be a fervor of a methodological discussion, or at least I would think that we could have more discussion, not just about the next themes of history, but about how do we write history? What are the methods, and what are the opportunities and possibilities, and what could we learn from other disciplines? And I don't think there's anything actually particularly French about this problem. I think it's a crisis, for me, of history writing and maybe of the humanities in general. And I think maybe we've learned the lessons of the cultural turn too well, and what we end up doing sort of de facto default is close reading of textual documents, and I would love us to think about trying to develop more tools than that. And so I'm delighted by this panel, which is following right after us, which I would encourage everyone to go to, which is talking about new method, and I think that's precisely, for me, where we will regain the traction and the central place that we had before, is by reaching out to those other disciplines and by taking advantage. When I talk to people in statistics, I talk to people in psych, they say, this must be a fabulous moment to be a historian. I said, why? Well, you have all this data out there, everything is available to you, you have all these tools, this is your fantastic moment. And I said, oh really? Because I'm not sure that we know that, or that we're trained to take advantage of that in the way that you think that we are. And so I think we are standing at a moment of enormous potential and opportunity, and it's a very exciting one. And so, and judging by this panel coming up next, but also different reflective panels that have been organized for this conference, it's really actually heartening to me to think that we're going in the right direction. So thank you.